Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Rod Korba, who is a counter weapons of mass destruction specialist at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA, a former motion picture producer and director, combat camera commander, and communication consultant. His PhD is in communication psychology. His research interests include information operations, branding and identity management, message design, and organizational innovation. Rod Korba, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John.
Rod, if you don't mind, let me start this off in typical fashion for the Cognitive Crucible, right? So before we start getting into Vygotsky's inner speech, could you please start by giving your overall assessment of our strategic landscape?
Well, I think most of us would agree that we're in an unprecedented transition to a global information society in which the consequence, velocity, and necessity of information has absolutely enabled malign sets of nations and networks to shift power away from the traditional centers of analysis and towards new forms of misinformation and disinformation that threaten to destabilize truth and facts, peace, and prosperity. So today's presentation, as we kind of wind through an introduction to Vygotsky and Vygotsky's work, it will end on some, I think, remarkable ways to think about what inner speech can do for us and how we need to incorporate this in our thinking and in our design, not only of research strategies, but assessment and things like that connected to information operations. So that's the essence of what I would like to try and share with you today.
All right, excellent. And Cognitive Crucible podcast listeners will recognize that this is the kind of question that I usually reserve for the end. But I wanted to ask if you could upfront, Rod, give an idea of what kind of research still needs to be done in this area. And this, I hope, will give our audience a bit of like an anchoring point for the rest of the conversation. So who was Vygotsky and why is his work important?
Well, our discussion today focuses on Vygotsky's frequently overlooked and generally underestimated concept of inner speech, or the use of internal words and their idiosyncratic meanings that differ in structure and function from the same words used in external speech. So there's a sort of internal cognitive crafting of meaning that's got an awful lot to do with Vygotsky's concept of inner speech. For Vygotsky, inner speech serves as an important catalyst and a dynamic process of adaptation that links the self to society, not only for acquiring social or conventional word meaning in external language, but for eventually establishing private and personal word meaning that fosters one's self-identity. For Vygotsky, inner speech is the primary tool of mentation, the ability to think conceptually through language. Vygotsky's internal language and inner speech mediate the difference between public and private thought. That's a wonderful way to kind of think about what this whole presentation is about and how we craft private thought from public thought. In this sense, inner speech is indispensable, a private tool of comprehension. It is, in a sense, a clandestine personal shorthand that fires memory, evokes macro concepts represented by word meanings, and serves as the catalyst for individual identity through the continually developing concept of self. Now, many of Vygotsky's major contributions are grounded in this dynamic contrast between internal and external word meanings developed through socialization. And we'll spend some time looking at how that exists with children, which was the main focus of a lot of his theoretic work. In this manner, inner speech impacts higher cortical function through the reflective process of both mediation and contrast. These functions include planning, critical thinking, learning, perspective taking, self-regulation, self-reflection, innovation, identity, and ultimately consciousness, which is something that Vygotsky was really eager to explore, but died prematurely. And we'll get into a little bit of his life history here. All right. So in this conversation, I'll tie the theoretical underpinnings of inner speech to multiple dimensions of Vygotsky's work. All right. In Vygotsky's early life, Lev Semenich Vygotsky was a Russian Soviet psychologist who survived tremendous social, political, and economic upheaval during his brief life. If you think your times are hard and your life has been hard, comparing yourself to Vygotsky, it makes you, in a sense, thankful for some of the things that have not transpired in your life. Okay. His father was a banker in the city of Gomel, and after homeschooling, he graduated with distinction from a private gymnasium, which allowed him to enter a lottery to attend the Imperial Moscow University in 1913. So he enters the university at the age of about 18 or so, where he enrolled as a medical student, later to transfer to the study of law. But Vygotsky's interests were in art and the study of tradition, culture, and identity. But in order to gain access to the university, he sort of had to pursue something that they really wanted him to do, and that would be medical work. How these topics were socialized and internalized through language became his real driving force in his career. Vygotsky entered the Imperial Moscow University in 1913, graduated in 1917 from the renamed Moscow State University. So the revolution of 1917 occurs immediately upon his graduation. So we have a slide change here.
Yep, I'm on slide 3 now.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just back up here. All right, so during this period, World War I began, the Tsar abdicated, the empire collapsed, and the October Revolution began. He was 21 years old through this entire process. And intellectuals at the university were suspected and discredited as Marxist fervor ran through academia. What emerges is the portrait of a young scholar seeking to find his calling. Vygotsky studied a range of topics, including sociology, linguistics, psychology, philosophy, and art, quite a mixed bag of forms of, in a sense, influence and communication. New academic ideas were made to conform and to support radically new economic, political, and social order. So was Vygotsky a Marxist? It's a good question. He was either a very good pragmatist or a very bad Marxist. That's my take on it. Perhaps he was both. But Vygotsky would have had to learn to play this game, and I think he played it well. So it's very, very hard to sort of cubbyhole him in who he really was. He took a stance against the formation of Marxist psychology as the approved alternative to philosophic and natural schools of thought. While attending Moscow Institute of Psychology, he contracted tuberculosis in 1920, and miraculously, it took him a few years, but he survived this. Tuberculosis was one of those diseases that claimed the vast majority of people who succumbed to the symptoms. He published extensively during this period, but his interests again were fragmented. So a slide change here.
Okay.
Vygotsky became the head of a subdepartment of the education of physically and mentally disabled children in the Department of Social and Legal Protection of Minors. If that doesn't sound like something that's a bit socialist in its making, I don't know what else you could call it. The summer of 1925 marked a turning point in Vygotsky's life and career. And upon his return from London, where he attended a congress on the education of the deaf, his tuberculosis relapsed and he was hospitalized again. And again, against all odds, he survived. In the autumn of 1925, Vygotsky was awarded his doctoral degree in abstention, and his dissertation was on the psychology of art. And I'll try and tie that in a little bit later with how that fits Vygotsky's major themes and his kind of direction As psychology began an academic practice in Europe, it did so in Russia between 1926 and 1930, real upheaval in terms of what academics would pursue in a socialist environment. It was during this time that the Vygotsky-Luria circle arose. And this is a circle of new thinkers in psychology that enjoyed a great deal of success. Vygotsky brought together various students, including Alexei Leontev, Boris Varshava, Leonid Zankov, and Alexandria Luria, and started to explore the development of higher cortical functions of language, comprehension, logic, memory, selected attention, and decision-making. Vygotsky, Luria, and Leontev would become known as the Russian troika of psychology, the people who really steered it in terms of its early development. Luria would later be credited as the father of neuropsychology for his clinical work with brain-injured victims during World War II. After a conflict with his superior, Vygotsky's research was transferred to the to the Academy of Communication in 1928. Now, it's interesting, and just a note here, that Pavlov is not on this list. Pavlov was considered to be a physiologist whose research on conditioned reflexes and classical conditioning influenced the rise of behaviorism in psychology. Soviet psychology was revolutionary in its assumptions that the study of mind and behavior in phylogenesis and ontogenesis had to originate in the culture and the material conditions in which people lived. Vygotsky was a contemporary of Piaget, who also studied language development in children, and they had different emphasis, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later.
Okay, and just so I'm tracking along here, Rod, this is great. I'm back on the slide with his major events, right?
You should be on slide 5, major events in
Yep.
Vygotsky's life.
Okay, all right, good, yeah.
Repeating that one. Okay.
Yeah.
So the question to the West is Vygotsky's work rooted in any important Soviet and Russian perspectives, which might help Western audiences to understand him. And again, Vygotsky was hardly a Marxist in his approach to learning and higher cortical function. Yet Vygotsky has been labeled an anti-Marxist, bourgeois psychologist for decades in his own country. His work united two conflicting approaches to society under Marxism, and this is kind of important. The role of biology in human development, because a lot of psychology kind of looked at how people are cast into the roles that they occupy in life through their biological development. Vygotsky eschewed that whole concept, which was popular with Marxism, and really emphasized the role of society and culturalization. Vygotsky argued that humans were biologically endowed to achieve higher cortical function through language, which was both socially and culturally defined. So he kind of unites this idea that we have this potential at birth because of our evolution as humans that has a biological basis, but upon birth, society and culture really define how the individual, in a sense, turns out. Specifically, Vygotsky examined how our social interactions influence our cognitive development. So, what were Vygotsky's major contributions to cognitive science? Vygotsky's social cultural theory on human development or child development says that cognitive development occurs as the result of social interaction. In this way, learning is innately collaborative. He believed social negotiation was essential for building knowledge and understanding concepts. Vygotsky invites, provokes, engages, and instructs these ideas. So Vygotsky's body of work, upon the death of Lenin in 1924, and again, this is a real tumultuous part of history in Russia, and a very, very difficult time to sort of know where to go and what to do in academia. And with the gradual rise of Stalin in the socialist collective movement, all work connected to the sciences and psychology have always been considered to be a science in Soviet Russia. Therefore, they became an official product of the state and were considered classified research. So for many, many years, you really couldn't get a hold of what Vygotsky published. And he didn't work with publishing companies outside of Russia because he was pulling his ideas together to a great extent. So it was very, very difficult to lay your hands on what Vygotsky was doing. And a lot of his contemporaries couldn't gain access to his work. Although he was a contemporary of Skinner, Pavlov, Freud, and Piaget, Vygotsky never attained their level of eminence during his lifetime. After his life, things became a lot more fluid in terms of his work and his reputation. The Russian Communist Party was often criticized Vygotsky's work, further making his writings obscured from the rest of the world. We have a slide in here about Vygotsky's family. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, this marked a period of adjustment in Vygotsky's life, both at the personal and theoretic level. As he grew aware of the deficiencies in his work, under the influence of holistic theories advocated by Gestalt psychology, he began to sort of repair and reassess some of his early thinking, but a major publication really eluded him. Vygotsky began to reconstruct his theories from a mechanistic orientation in the 1920s to an integrated holistic science in the 1930s. This was the dawn of the psychological school of thought known as constructivism. Vygotsky began to formulate a psychological theory of consciousness. Unfortunately, he died of tuberculosis on June 11th, 1934, leaving his theory unfinished and his thoughts scattered across multiple documents. He was just 37 years of age. His premature death also contributed to his obscurity. After Vygotsky's death, Joseph Stalin banned his work from publication for more than 20 years, and later his works remained inaccessible to the West due to the Cold War. Much of Vygotsky's work did not begin to circulate in Europe and America until the 1960s, and only a couple of Vygotsky's texts were published in English before the translation of Thinking and Speech, a posthumous collection of his papers and lectures in 1962. Now, I want to make a point here because when you study Vygotsky, you have to study the translation of his materials. And so what he published, in a sense, in Russia, called Thinking and Speech, became Thought and Language when it was published by the MIT Press. Now, that may not seem like any kind of large leap, but in the lexicon of communication, the difference between thought and thinking and between speech and language can be enormous. So what we get is a sort of flavor for what Vygotsky meant or what the translators thought that he meant. And so Hampton and Vakar, with their 1962 version and then the MIT Press, were given this challenge of trying to figure out what's the difference between language and speech. And Vygotsky uses the term speech originally, but we think of it as language today. Now, how much of those two words overlapped, that's part of the difficulty in the translation. Vygotsky's ideas greatly influenced theories of psychology and education and continue to play an important role in educational practices today. So we have a slide here that kind of contrasts Vygotsky with Piaget, and you can read through those distinctions yourself. I'm going to try and summarize this rather quickly. This slide contrasts Vygotsky and Piaget and the theories of childhood development. Vygotsky published The Language and Thought of the Child in 1923, and it was again a little bit scattered in terms of its focus. It wasn't until later, with the publication of Thought and Language, that a lot of this sort of coalesced. He recorded his observations of children talking to themselves in classrooms and observed the mimetic speech, which is the earliest use of private speech. And we're heading into this distinction between external language for public consumption, internal language for childhood development, and then inner speech as a tool that children learn for the rest of their lives. For Piaget, egocentric speech was a sign of cognitive immaturity. Vygotsky didn't see it that way at all. He thought egocentric speech would later develop into a fully mature and effective speech after children gained a fair amount of cognition and communication skills. And the graphic illustrates their key thoughts. You can take a look at those. Vygotsky embodied the cognitive approach to psychology, specifically that a child's thoughts were constructed through the socio-cultural process of cognitive development, and that children learn to think through internalizing social language or social thought. It is through this lens that his zone of proximal development and his work in that area of childhood development is grounded. So now a slide change here. We talk about some of the major contributions to psychology in Vygotsky's work. Number one would have to be the social origin of mind. Vygotsky believed that human mental and cognitive abilities are created and shaped through the use of language. But when we talk about language, again, this is that disjunction in translation, because I believe in looking at his history and especially his interest in art, which we'll kind of get to in just a moment, that when Vygotsky uses the term language, he implies not only verbal language, but nonverbal and visual language and vocal language. Anything that we use to construct meaning would be part of the language and the language tools that I believe he was dealing with. But this is not really clear in his work. I would argue that including verbal, auditory, and visual languages as tools in the process of interacting with and constructing the cultural and social environment. Now, development cannot be separated from its social context. And three main concepts of cognitive development that Vygotsky posed were: culture is a significant tool in learning. Language is the root of culture, and individuals learn and develop within their roles in the community. His second major contribution is the importance of mediation. Vygotsky saw mediation, and it's interchangeable, I think, the way he used the term. The word integration comes to mind as the key to human development. Learning through the use of social and cultural tools that become a pathway for psychological development is interiorization. So this idea that you really take what's out there and you use it through different principles and practices to evolve internally, that's really where learning takes place. His third major contribution is in the zone of proximal development, which we just mentioned. And Vygotsky's introduction to the concept of ZPD, which refers to the gap between the child's current level of development and the level they are capable of reaching with tools provided by others with more knowledge. We have a slide change here. The zone of proximal development posits that humans learn by mastering increasingly complex tasks in collaboration with more capable mentors. Vygotsky called this process scaffolding. And when you think about a child beginning to experiment with language, beginning to use words, and it's always somewhat comical the way children do this, Vygotsky dug into that pretty deeply. And we'll show you a little bit later about some of the examples that he found, that the patterns that children use to internalize what is external information. At the beginning of childhood development, there exists the act or the object independent of the word. Children don't know words, they need to learn them. Then at the end of the zone of proximal development, which takes about 5 or 6 years, there exists the word, which becomes the act in itself. The word makes us independent of the act or object itself. And so this emphasis on word translates, when we move into inner speech, the importance of word meaning. And in a way, it really identifies all of these internal states that we use to incorporate knowledge into words. It is the transition between exposure to language and the cognitive, internal unification and socialization of language that eventually give rise to the concept of inner speech. All right, so Inner speech, we need to sort of define what that is and give you some examples before we get to the raw context of how it works. Vygotsky believed internal speech. Now, internal speech is different than public speech, and internal speech is private, but not yet inner speech. One of the slides that's coming up will help you to sort of organize that. Vygotsky believed internal speech develops from external speech via gradual processes of internalization. Thought itself develops socially or externally, but functions privately or internally. Vygotsky claimed that that in its mature form, our inner speech would not resemble spoken language as we know it. And so the thought processes that we use rapidly to discern perceptions, to react to stimuli, to have conversations, this is not the same thing internally that we use externally in terms of sharing meaning. It is syntactically crushed and semantically complex. Okay. I just lost my notes.
Yeah, sorry about that. I clicked out of the screen share for just a moment. So yeah, do what you got to do to get your notes back up. And I've got the slide up right now that is mediation and internalization.
Yeah, let's go through that because I think we have 4 quadrants here.
That's
The
the one,
one,
yeah.
yeah. So we look at public application and we look at private application, and clearly there is no such thing as a vocal private application. So that northeastern quadrant is vacant. So we start with social speech, external language, and social influence. And there are 4 characteristics there of how that operates. And adults teach children from social speech to internal speech. And this is where children begin to mimic, begin to adapt to word meaning. That's all part of what children learn in language. And then we move from that silent internal speech to a far more sophisticated level that is Vygotskyan inner speech. And this is characteristic of the way in which we operate as adults. Children have to fuse together that internal word meaning. Vygotsky would argue that the shift between internal speech or private speech to inner speech is a massive transition for the child and in its approach to adulthood, and in a sense, owning meaning individually as opposed to owning meaning socially, or adapting to both of those and working back and forth so that you know that your use of the word apple may differ from someone else's use of the word apple. And the private concept of thought is both silent, it's syntactically crushed, it's semantically elaborate, and it's highly egocentric. So now let me see if I can get back to my notes.
So I think I'm on slide 10 right now. Was that what you were just talking through, slide 10?
Yes,
Okay.
that was that quad chart.
Okay. So do we need to go to the next slide now?
No, let me run down through some of this
Okay.
and look at the clock here. I'll have to speed this up a little bit. All right, so what is Vygotsky relationship between thought and language? We'll try and get through this kind of quickly here. Language makes concrete our abstract cognitive processes. And here's where he relies more on verbal language, I think, in terms of learning, but really acknowledges that there is all kinds of sensate learning that takes place. And there's internal cognition, the evolution of original thought in language. All of these things fuse together through inner speech. Languages are our means of understanding and sharing the world. This use of verbal language is the foundation for later complex mental activity. Vygotsky would argue that languages shape the way we think. We transmit knowledge across minds through language. Vygotsky argued that thought is not merely expressed in words, it comes to existence through them. Thus, thought is constituted in language, both verbal, vocal, and nonverbal, and language really is responsible for the construction of a great deal of the reality that we share internally and with others. Vygotsky used speech to infer language, but as an example of all forms of language, not simply verbal language alone. And this is where we tie that aforementioned dissertation in the psychology of art. We know that Vygotsky was deeply involved in visual as well as verbal languages. In his dissertation on the psychology of art, Vygotsky laid the foundation for understanding that all types of language, art, music, theater, photography, fiction, fables, are tools for learning and internal growth. And all forms of language that impinge upon the senses are cultural tools that play a cardinal role in mental development. Thus, for Vygotsky, art enables us to experience thought that we would never otherwise experience. So the representation of imagery from one mind translates through the canvas to someone else, but that really influences us. The arts as tools enable us to transcend our senses and create new knowledge and new ways of thinking. The arts are possible ways to push beyond the senses to experience another person's mind and another person's interpretation of perceptions. And Vygotsky suggests that this can only be accomplished through the use of languages. So how does Vygotsky's emphasis on collaborative learning impact his work? All right. Vygotsky would argue that collaborative learning is the bridge between the external speech and internal speech. We've mentioned that already. So just to emphasize this a little bit, give some examples here. External speech supports the acquisition of information and requires skills that a child does not yet possess or cannot use independently, but can accomplish with the help of a more knowledgeable other. As children mature and their own word meanings, as opposed to the meanings they learn from others, they enter the zone of proximal development. And again, continue this maturation until the age of about 8 or 9, when private interpretation of words circumvent the social meaning accorded to those words by others. Vygotsky argued that thought and speech are initially separate cognitive functions that begin to merge around the age of 3. Internal speech, private speech, develops as children use social speech in a self-directed manner to guide and control their behavior. In imaginary play, this is known as acting out loud. But private speech is also used for direct memorization, mimetic behavior, or for rehearsal of speech that is meant for public consumption. So it is, in a sense, we try and separate that out a little bit from the creative process of word meaning. So with inner speech, it takes place inside of you, but it has multiple functions. Internal speech serves as the cultural, social tool or symbol system of language, first used for interpersonal communication, and it is applied by the child overtly, not for communication with others, but for communication with self and self-guidance. Initially, children learn through the imitation or mimicry known as mimetic behavior. Children invent words for things that are important to them, and we see our own children doing this as they grow older, that they cannot pronounce and do not yet understand. Initially, these are usually applied to nouns. So papa, mama, those are key terms that children are exposed to in their language acquisition, and they mimic, what people, in a sense, say to them. So when you get close to a child and you use the word papa or mama, it really has a meaning yet to be discovered, but a significance. But children also internalize external meanings for words. So we find woobies or blankies or things like that being named by children. And if that word is mentioned and the adult produces, in a sense, the object, that ties it together in the child's mind. So this is internal speech, and the growth of inner speech, is right around the corner here. Inner speech is the outcome of the developmental process that begins at 6 or 7 and is influenced by the internal and dynamic meanings the child develops for words through social interaction. All right. So our real self-directed language, our identity lies in inner speech, which becomes private in nature through the rest of our lives. All right. So when you sort of wonder what people are really thinking, we'll really never know what their word meanings are. We only have the vestiges of how they use them in a social context. But the child learns to develop a meaning that is publicly accepted and a meaning that is privately engaged. That's truly what inner speech is. So private speech slows down in late elementary school years as children stop talking aloud and instead start to use inner speech exclusively.
Hey, Rod, do you think maybe we could? We've got several questions, and we've also got about 15 minutes before the top of the hour. How about we do this? How about we try to maybe answer a couple of questions, and then we can continue on with your presentation. You've still got a few slides left, and those who can stick around, great. If not, you can catch it on the YouTube or on the podcast. But for those who've asked a couple of questions, let's go ahead and take those now before some people have to drop off. Does that sound
Works
okay?
for me. That's
Okay.
fine.
All right. Fantastic. All right. So let me go to the chat here and grab a couple of these questions. So uh, or actually, if Bart is still on, Bart, could you just unmute and ask the question that you dropped into the chat? And I'll ask the other people who dropped some questions in to do the same after this. So Bart, if you're there, could you go for it?
Yes, thank you, John, and really enjoying the presentation thus far. How about I give you two to pick from, and you address the one that you're most comfortable with and is the least stupid. Uh, the first, thinking about your description of this, uh, what it brings to mind is the statistical nature of the associated word probabilities when you're training an LLM, and wondering what lessons we may learn from this social speech and inner speech related to LLM training. The second option would be the inner speech, specifically the Vygotsky inner speech. Is there the requirement for a metacognitive capability, and how should we think about moving from that the inner speech quadrant up to the social speech quadrant, and how that would differ in neurodivergent versus neurotypical individuals? Over.
Thank you. Let's go with the second one. And I hope my expertise can answer that question for you. I think we have to learn in terms of unpacking the way that individuals use common terminology. So if we were thinking about trying to counter disinformation, and we are thinking about how meaning exists in key words, we're going to have to learn, I think, how to tap into the multiple possibilities that words that we share do not have the same meaning. And I think we need to develop tools that help us to unpack that. Um, there is a form of a Likert scale that uses a concept and bipolar types of opposites. I think those techniques, in terms of giving people a way to express what they hold as meaning, and hopefully with artificial intelligence, we might be able to process large amounts of data that way to get a real cultural sense for what specific words that we would use as a sender really mean to our audience as receivers. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thank you, sir.
All right, next. Well, so Bart, you dropped two questions in there, so I think maybe you asked them both. John Fuis, could you unmute and
Yeah,
ask your question, please?
sure. So it's a great discussion. I love the discussion. I'm curious how you compare Vygotsky, if at all, with, say, Feldman Barrett's constructed emotion theory, right? That's more recent, or with McCall Simon's identity and identity theory, which seems to have also been a somewhat updated version of Vygotsky in the 60s. Or is there a dramatic difference that I'm missing here?
Um, I'm sorry to tell you that I'm not familiar with those two works, but I would certainly love to take a look at those and get back to you, later to answer that question. But I'd be stabbing in the dark, unfortunately.
Sorry to do that.
Any other questions? Oh, there is another one from Jeff Schulman. Jeff, could you ask your question, please?
Oh, I was just trying to write down Barrett's theory. So I guess I do have a question. One of the things that I studied last semester a bit was proximal learning, if I remembered correctly. And something else that I've been thinking about is peripheral memory formation. We know in things like cuttlefish and octopus that we have the ability to partially externalize our memory, and from the perspective of John Wheeler's participatory universe and the projection of our, the projection of our mind in the creation of our own universe. I'm wondering how much that tie-in has been evaluated here with Vygotsky.
I don't think there's much done there at all. I think that a part of what we have later on in the presentation, which we may or may not get to, is the way in which the evolution of humans have created the platform and the capacity for spoken language. And that differs in terms of humans versus other species. But that doesn't mean that they don't have language themselves or don't use language, in the same, not in the same fashion, but for the same purposes that we use language. The important characteristic of inner speech is its brevity, and it being syntactically crushed and semantically elaborate. One word is the skin of a thought, and that really is what enables us to think rapidly and move rapidly and to problem solve rapidly. So this word meaning that we've really yet to dig into has a tremendous amount of implication for where we are in terms of measuring social meaning. And I think that's that. I don't know that animals have social meaning. I know that biologically they're endowed for the languages that they process, whether they're chemical, whether they're visual, whether they're auditory, et cetera. But I think more could probably be done there that would help us to understand perhaps the way in which these animals engage with themselves and with us.
Thank you so much. I'm led to I've been contemplating this for a while, that where I lost my inner voice, I don't know, back in college. And, I've seen studies that some people, well into their adulthood still have this inner voice, but it seems like this Vygotskian inner speech is actually a collapse of that private or internal speech once you, I don't know, achieve sufficient complexity. So this is just very, very, very interesting to me. Thank you so much for sharing.
I don't think we lose our inner speech. Your ability to, in a sense, create a sentence really relies upon a speech pattern, in a sense, that you retrieve words and put them together syntactically. And we do this in an extraordinarily rapid fashion. So I'm not certain that problem solving, recognizing objects, this is not the conversation that we hold with ourselves in the Platonic sense. But inner speech is really there all the time. It's just that we don't, if we're driving a car and we're in traffic and somebody pulls out in front of us or does one of those New Jersey box passes, whatever we want to call them here in DC, you don't say to yourself, it's time to move into the next lane. I mean, it happens instantaneously, but there's language connected with that as well.
Yeah, that's why I differentiated inner voice versus inner speech.
Okay.
I'd like to, moderator's prerogative here, just real quick, and circle back to the top. And I put this in the chat for everybody to look at, but I wanted to ask Rod if you could revisit your research question, and I'll read it so that people listening on the podcast can get it too. But your research question, you would suggest that an interested student investigate a participatory way of developing a framework to measure word meaning, especially in a cultural context. And you assert that if successful, this kind of a tool can become an input into measuring messaging effectiveness. And measures of effectiveness when it comes to cognitive security and operations in the information environment are of great interest to the community. So do you think you could revisit this research question now that you've been discussing Vygotsky's inner speech a little bit more?
Yeah, I do believe that we've reached, in a sense, a sense of limitation in how we measure effectiveness through language and how we use language to understand the perspective of an audience. And when it comes to things like disinformation, clearly there's a lot to unpack there. But understanding a lot more about the way in which people's minds work and their experiences contribute to all of that, this is really something that I think there's a need to create a greater dynamism, between what the subjects think and not necessarily what the word we use to offer the question implies. And so getting into that concept of an internal speech, it's really asking more of the participants to frame what they mean by the term rather than the way we use that term, to imply how we would influence someone. So it's, in a sense, more of a listening than it is a speaking in terms of getting after this complicated word meaning and how that operates.
Yeah. All right. Are there any other questions before I'm sure people will have to start dropping off, but I'll also ask Rod to continue. But any other questions, just come off mute and let her rip. Okay. All right. Well, then, Rod, I have us at about the end of
12:55. Yeah.
the end of slide 10. Yeah, 12:55. So if people have to drop, drop, and we'll
That's okay.
have this YouTube available on the IPA Slack channel. But Rod, I have us at the end of slide 10, and you're going to pick up on talking about inner speech more.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's pick up with a question. Do we answer our own questions? At times, yes, we do. Who has not had the experience of reaching for that name of an individual, the title of a movie, the name of a restaurant, only to have these answers materialize minutes, hours, and even days later? They pop up and they mystify us. Well, our minds never really shut down, even during speech, and we go into memory or search mode. The cognitive circuitry continues to function, even against the foreground of other cortical activities. This certainly qualifies as talking to ourselves, but with a delayed response mechanism. So yes, I think there's a lot more of this that goes on than we really realize. But when we talk to ourselves, that could be neurocircuitry, looking to fire and make connections. And in a sense, we do come up with an answer, even though the answer is delayed. Let me kind of change and I want to move into the characteristics of Vygotsky and inner speech and deal with that a little bit more fully. So we talk about those four characteristics. Syntactically crushed is a way that we eliminate predication in terms of communication and understanding. We just go right to the core of what the internal thought is, and we don't predicate at all. Minimum syntactic structure, omission of the subject, which is intuitively known, and unnecessary words for economy of thought. They they move in that direction. And this takes advantage of the power of ellipsis or compression of thought. And were it not, I think this is in a sort of an evolutionary concept, if we didn't have inner speech, we couldn't react significantly to certain types of threats in which we have to unpack what that threat represents. And sometimes it's a fight-flight response, but at other times it's more significant than that. And inner speech enables us to really pull together rapidly, what our interpretation is, what our meaning is, and what our past memory is relative to the words we use. Semantic complexity is another key factor here. A word represents the skin of a thought, which is normally a complex cognitive structure based upon meaning in various social and cultural contexts. Word meaning is complex. We talk about Biden, we talk about Trump, and right away try to unpack that word meaning. And we find a great deal of disagreement in what those words really imply. And this is the essence, in a sense, of stereotyping, which is part of the difficulty or part of the complexity of thinking in inner speech, is it really lends itself to stereotypical thought. And you really have to move your way through that and question whether indeed you are looking at previously constructed meaning and not looking at the exception to the rule, or not looking at something else that would challenge that meaning. Of course, it's idiosyncratic. Different cultures and languages, experiences, and those types of things lead to different word meanings. And all of our knowledge and life experience contributes towards that skin of a thought. And it's also, the last bastion that we have of, private meaning. So when we talk about privacy, this is really important in terms of our thoughts and our identity. So when, someone, a significant other says, does this shirt make me look heavy? You really want to delay your response. You really have to think through what that ultimately means. And, a yes or a no, not necessarily the best social answer, but internally, you've probably got an answer there, because it's highly idiosyncratic in terms of what one thinks about public appearance. And of course, it's silent. So now moving on to sort of word meaning. Let me see if we can get here. And this is a critical construct for Vygotsky. And again, it's cognitively shaped to be a generalization. That's what word meaning is. But inner speech is not the interior aspect of external speech. It's a function in itself. It remains speech, i.e. thought connected with words. But while external speech thought is embodied in words, inner speech words are actually a form of thought. Inner speech is, to a large extent, thinking in pure meaning, and the meaning is known to the individual. It is not known socially. It is a dynamic, shifting, unstable thing fluttering between words and thought, and the two are more or less stable. So I think we don't speak like we think, and we don't think like we speak. When you're dealing with Vygotskian inner speech, you really have to separate that process out. And I think that's a useful phrase to keep in mind, that, we don't really share our private thoughts and our private generalizations or word meanings, with people that we don't trust, and with people who might use that kind of thought against us. And because we're social animals, we're very, very careful of, in a sense, unpacking inner speech and preparing, in a sense, through public speaking, how we share that information with others. So there is indeed, a genetic determination of our capability here. I think if you would stop and sort of say to yourself, how do we process vocalization? How do we come up with a thought and express it verbally? There is so much autonomic behavior in spoken language in our speech apparatus that it really is mystifying how rapidly and how much brain capacity we use just to construct sentences. And I know many of my colleagues would say that we all start out with an idea that is a verbalization, and we look at our audience and we react to their response. And in the middle of a sentence, we're capable of changing, in a sense, and re-emphasizing the word meaning that we use and anticipating what that reaction is, to have the entire sentence revolve in such a way that it has the, how can I put it, the intended effect. So our language, we can be in the middle of really expressing a thought and really reconstructing the thought in mid-sentence and having it all come out syntactically correct. So there's an awful lot of internal capacity that's really dedicated, through respiratory, phonatory, and articulatory mechanisms within the body. And it involves, a coordination of a lot of bodily organs, the tongue, the lips, the teeth, the lungs, vocal cords, the velum, soft and hard palate, larynx, pharynx, all of this, goes into producing a single word. And yet we can rapidly, construct meaning from all of this. So there's a lot of mechanism internally that's dedicated to spoken language. And that process of how we could tap into all of that internal processing, it's called subvocalization. And when you talk, you vocalize. When you think, you literally subvocalize. And sometimes we can see that in people moving their lips and with tremors that occur with their speech apparatus. And there is the potential that you can measure that type of thing to work your way back into potentially what it is that someone's thinking. So subvocalization is an important part of that speech apparatus. So let me pause here, John, and see where we are with our audience and see if there's still people holding on.
Sure. Yeah, it looks like there's still quite a few people on. I'm on the slide that is showing your homunculus.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that slide really it's a gross representation, but what it does is it really shows the amount of cortical tissue in the sensor motor strip that's really devoted to measuring, in a sense, applying, a response, a cortical response, to the construction of language. And it is amazing that we're capable of doing so much, but then again, so much of our cortical capacity, as represented through that particular model, really gives us the ability to articulate and again, connecting meaning with the social process of external speech. There's a lot of translation that goes on as we really process language and use language. So I think that's important to keep in mind. That's often overlooked in terms of inner speech. I want to try and get to this discussion of inner speech and identity, because I think that's really important to sort of what word meanings are.
Yep. And I just changed to the slide with the bullseyes for values and beliefs and attitudes and opinions. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Let's go to that.
Yep.
Our inner speech really connects our interiority. It really helps us to stabilize and think quickly and act efficiently. And a lot of this has to deal with, in a sense, the concrete nature of how we construct that interiority. So I'm a believer that values have a great impact as a kind of the core of who we are as humans. And we represent those values lots of different ways. And as we move outward, in a sense, towards public behavior, our values, which we don't always share with people, our values are critical. And our beliefs are based upon those values. Some people would reverse the order, but beliefs can really deal with something for which there is no evidence to support. And sometimes people believe things because they make them comfortable. There's a whole argument about religion, that really deals with this. And the values, that support a belief system like that are really critically important. And as we move from values to beliefs, socially, then we have attitudes. And attitudes really are an expression within a community of what meaning, what kind of meaning occurs. And then when we move out from that level, we talk about opinion. And opinion is really sharing, in a sense, what an attitude is, but it's based upon beliefs and values. And that core of who we are is really defined to a large degree by our inner speech. So when we use words like courage or honesty or bravery, those things may be used to define ourselves. And that may be, the basis for some of the social situations we find ourselves in, and some of the language we use in those social situations may be value driven more than they are belief driven, or they may be attitudinal in that they work in a specific environment. And so we adjust our attitudes for the people that we're with. We adjust our attitudes and our inner speech, based upon what our goals are. So there's a very rapid kind of a synthesis that occurs in a social context. I think Vygotsky would embrace that tremendously. And we know that it takes some sizable shock, for people who grown into their values and grown into their concept of self. In order to change a value structure, it's really going to be a seismic kind of a shift. The death of a close family member might foster a question about the values that we hold. It might foster a question about our beliefs. But generally speaking, we have constructed those values and beliefs because they reflect who we are, part of our self-identity, and they work in our favor in order to move quickly in situations and with a certain assuredness that we are not going to engage in hypocritical behavior. It's that cognitive dissonance kind of thing. So again, the construction of all of that really has a lot to do with inner speech. So I'm going to move down here. Let's see. We've gotten through the core of the dynamic self.
Are we moving on to your slide that shows the I don't know how you describe it, the megaphones?
Yes. Okay.
Okay. That's
Yeah,
you've got several slides that depict a similar diagram, but I guess they advance and change a little bit.
Yeah, I've always wondered, and I think it's possible to do it. I just don't have the resources, but a view of human perception, that really deals with the way we gather information and how we use, in a sense, represented by filters here in this model. The model number one shows the power of ellipsis, and the ellipsis is moving all of that into a compressed form, and that's what we store in memory. And so with all of the different filters that we use to gather perceptions and interpret perceptions, all of that moves into memory through the power of elimination. And what we store is not nearly as complex as what we perceived. Last time I came to that realization was standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon and convincing myself that this was a spectacular view. But now that I think back upon that, it was a view, and it was deep and it was colorful and it was dynamic, but I've lost so much of the detail. And I think that's what really happens when the power of ellipsis really we've got to, in a sense, be economical about what we store and about how we store information. And that's really what we put into memory. And so the left-hand side is taking this broad kind of, it sort of does look like a bugle or something like that as we move down towards the elimination of a necessary detail. That's clearly part of what happens with inner speech. But the reason why there are a couple slides here is because this is something that if I could animate it, it would be really interesting, I think, to share how all of this functions in terms of different objects, different events, different circumstances, how it all interprets that as we move into memory. So on one hand, there's 4 or 5 slides here that just show you what some of the variables would look like if we could animate, how this perceptual process works and how it feeds into inner speech and this, elliptical kind of memory. On the other hand, one of the things that's truly a research question that really deserves a lot more attention is what do we do when we have compressed all of this data and all of this meaning into 1 or 2 key words, or something that signifies the economy of effort that inner speech provides to us. When we take that word back out again and we move to the right side of those models, we fill things in. It isn't necessarily what we perceived, but it's what sort of makes sense to us as we expand upon what that internal belief system was, whether it was values, beliefs, attitudes, or opinions. It's really intriguing that once you compress all this stuff, you really need to expand it. And in that expansion, we actually create meaning. We actually move towards things that make a more integrated whole, make a better explanation, but they're truly not what we perceived when we were condensing all of that. When we expand it, we fill in, and often fill in ways that support our values, our beliefs, our attitudes, and our opinions. So that model is sort of there to play with this idea that we do a lot of work on that left-hand side, but very, very little work on what happens when we, again, take that core meaning and make it socially acceptable. So
That's, I mean, this is a really, really interesting series of diagrams. Well, for Rod, where did these diagrams come from? Are these things that you created, or is this?
came right out of my mind.
Oh, really? Okay,
It
that's
may have more to do,
that's outstanding.
with how I think. But in sharing those models with students and you know, I think it's a fairly effective way of allowing people to see just how personalized they make the world, you know, in terms of what we retain and, again, what we share. But what we share, that's a really interesting piece that very little research exists because it's so hard to measure inner speech. But we do know that people will, in a sense, make the outcome, in a sense, more compatible with the way they think. And so is it lying or is it exaggeration? I'm not sure it's either of those, but it's certainly, there is this process of making it familiar with self. So I suppose that's the best way to put it.
Do you mind if I inject a question here? Because, you know, hearing you talk through this model and the dynamics, I really find it fascinating, especially the part about, you know, consuming a, you know, really complex environmental stimuli, consuming that, but as you're consuming it, you're simplifying it, or you're turning it from sights and sounds into you know, very condensed representations of what it is that the person is consuming. But I'm curious, if you squint, you can almost kind of see like Shannon's communication model in this same representation that you have here. I'm curious if you could somehow adapt this slightly into like a Shannon communication context. Do you kind of get what I'm asking?
Absolutely. And I think that it's parallel in structure, not parallel in function. Of course, message, channel, receiver, effect. You know, that's that, in a sense, whole concept on the left-hand side. And again, we reverse it on the right-hand side. But the feedback loops, you know, to each one of those filters, and the filters are, you know, convex on the left-hand side so that they focus down, and concave on the right-hand side so they expand. That's all part of, yeah, that's the way we think. So it's a little bit like input, throughput, output. You know, and in that sense, you know, the throughput is really what we store in memory. That's really what carries us forward. But I think you're right, John. I think there's a lot that the model tries to capture some of that, but it would be possible, I think, to help to bring that together in the fashion that you described, and that Shannon Weaver's model is really applicable here.
Yeah. Well, since we're at a bit of a pause here, we still have some folks on the line. Are there any other questions percolating that we could pose to Rod right now? If so, just come off mute and let her rip.
So Rod, can you illustrate how this model works by saying, you know, illustrating for us if on the left-hand side of the model, vote for my candidate goes in, how does that go through the model and come back out the other side with a response?
I'm sorry, did you say vote for my candidate? I had difficulty understanding what you said.
That is what he said.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether he dropped
And
off.
something goes on the right side.
Yeah, let's see if we can unpack that a little bit. If you are talking about voting as an activity, I think the filters, which can change their order and can change their, in a sense, complexity, would enable you to take a candidate and look at a candidate in such a way that you either support or refute what that candidate's platforms are. So in the sum total of what kind of moves from the left side into memory, you're creating likes and dislikes, I think, in terms of what that candidate represents. And I think you also fall back clearly on your values and your belief system. I know that in the current, milieu of politics, we sort of have a candidate who is outside the system and portrays himself as being outside the system. And does that have value to you? And in what capacity? And how does that resonate with, your particular set of filters that you pass information through? And those filters may have to do with your comfort level, your economic status in society, your educational status, your opportunities. That's one dimension of a candidate. And you might respond to shaping your image through how it passes through, whether you feel as though you can accomplish what you want in the society or whether you're being held back. It may pass through filters that deal with what the people have afforded, riches and can do certain things and get away with them, as opposed to people who don't have those resources. That could shape the candidate. That's a sort of a filter. We'd have to work to try and describe that, what that would be. But you tend, I think, and I didn't put the cognitive codex in this, which is that huge sort of framework for understanding what our biases are. But, these filters can really work as those particular biases, to make all of the input from a candidate like an echo chamber that just reinforces, exactly how you see things. So when you go to defend your candidate, when you go to try and persuade other people that your candidate that you have stored in that consolidated form is the appropriate candidate, then you begin to expand upon these things. And so the filters reverse themselves and become, concave. And ultimately, you can use whatever filter system you want to get to an argument that you make or conversation that you have. And so, yes, I think because it's human in its nature, this is the way we process. And so we're taking something rather complicated, but I think as you filter it through and if time were available, and if we could animate this, you could see how a specific subject would cause all kinds of change within the apparatus that we perceive, and how we view that candidate and store things in memory. And it's going to be based upon values, beliefs, et cetera. But those are part of that filtering system that enables us to eliminate a lot and focus on what's important to us. It's just like if you were in Times Square, if you can imagine yourself there, very busy place, lots of lights, and you're there to be entertained, and there might be something that's playing on the side of a building that would entertain you, you would focus on that. If you're there and you're hungry, you might all of a sudden perceive the golden arches, because that's where you are right now. That's your internal state. And so we're scanning the environment. So whether it's a complex array or whether it's the complexity of a person, we're still using this perceptual system to sort of build that meaning and then elaborate upon that. Again, this is what we believe or what we think we understand, and now we're trying to share that with other people. You build that and you build it out again in terms of detail. You build that out again in terms of what we see that is right within the array, or important within the array, or important within the person, you still build that back out again on the right-hand side. Helpful?
Yes, thank you.
That's dynamite, Rod. Any other questions before we conclude? All right. Well, I think that about does it. So again, this presentation will be available for IPA members on via our Slack channel. Rod, not to put you on the spot here, I can edit this out if your answer is no. But what is your feeling on me sharing the notes that you put together and also the slides? Yes or no?
I think I would probably take the notes that I shared and take the emphasis that's has to do with the underlining and things like that. I just remove that and
Okay.
say, yeah, let's just take that away.
Okay.
And here's the data.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, then for IPA members as well, we will make these materials that Rod put together for this available. And also, Rod, if you don't mind me saying, you're also working on putting this into a academic article, are you not?
Yeah, I think that I've invested enough and discovered enough in this process that there are some things that I think are worth sharing with the academic community, perhaps not at the level of academic publication, but in a more formal way. I certainly think that the people who look at disinformation and misinformation could benefit by this approach and an understanding Vygotsky in terms of how we would be far more accurate in terms of our assessment of our communication capabilities or designing messages for specific audiences. I think Vygotsky has a lot to share there. So I think it might be something that is published in a government journal rather than an academic journal.
Okay, great. Well, I'm sure everybody will be waiting with bated breath for this to come out.
And thank you all for putting up with this entire process and sorting through my random kind of delivery here. And again, it's a deep project and there are lots of dimensions to it. So could be talking about this for a while.
Yeah. All right. Well, and signing off in the usual fashion, Rod Korba, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
You're welcome, John.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.